Good evening and welcome to yet another edition of our One Night Stand series. This is where we look at one work by one artist for one night. Tonight we're going to be looking at a work by Grant Wood, Misty Day, Fountain of the Observatory in Paris. It is a work that is currently on view in our Grant Wood From Farm Boy to American Icon exhibition. It is a relatively early work for the artist, and it shows him working in his American Impressionist style. I chose this work tonight because we just closed our really wonderful, terrific exhibition that our curator Julia Jessen put on for the summer called Strokes of Genius, which looked at American Impressionism drawn from our own collection. This piece was not pulled out of the Grant Wood exhibition to join others in the Strokes of Genius exhibition because we have plenty of other wonderful Grant Wood impressionistic works that were incorporated in that particular exhibition. But I wanted to kind of highlight Misty Day. It is a lovely, charming, fabulous little picture that I enjoy looking at time and time again. And for me, there are personal associations because I know exactly where Grant Wood was painting this painting. And I've been in that locale as well. And so it brings back all kinds of fond personal memories for me. And it really does sort of mark a moment in time in Grant Wood's life and career. And we'll be exploring that in further depth this evening. So thank you for joining us this evening. I will go ahead and share my screen and get onto the PowerPoint here. Okay, and we'll do the slideshow here from the beginning. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at Grant Wood's Misty Day Fountain Observatory. It dates from 1920, and that was an important sort of moment for Grant Wood. That was a painting that he created on site in Paris and was the result of a trip that he took to Paris with his best friend Marvin Cohn. And I wanted to include the dates here of the trip itself. So it was a long journey. Marvin Cohn had been to France before as part of World War I. And then when they were waiting to ship the GIs back or they were shipping the GIs back to the United States in stages, Marvin Cohn took advantage of a kind of a thank you offer that the French government offered to the GIs so they could stay and take classes at French universities. And so Marvin Cohn actually stayed several months in France after the war and took classes in Montpellier at the École des Beaux-Arts in Montpellier. And so when he returned to the United States in 1919, he vowed to go back to France again, specifically to Paris. And that is what he was able to do in the summer of 1920, taking his best friend Grant Wood with him. Marvin Cohn was a great asset to Grant Wood on his trip to Paris because Marvin Cohn was fluent in French. In fact, his role in World War I was as a translator, as a French translator, on the front line for a couple of generals. And so he knew French very, very well, and that was great because Grant Wood knew no French at all. And so it made the trip to Paris much easier for them. They did leave Cedar Rapids on June 6th, went to Chicago, took the train to Montreal, shipped out of Montreal, and landed in Liverpool, England, and spent some days in England, in London, and then made their way down to the Channel, and then crossed the Channel and got themselves into Paris. And they arrived in Paris on June 25th. So it took some time to get over there. But these are the dates in which Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn were actually in Paris. 54 days in total. And the original hotel they were going to stay in was all sort of filled up with Red Cross people, still sort of post-war. And so they found a kind of a room in a Fleabag hotel. In fact, Marvin Cohn's diary from the summer of 1920 gives us great insights into what they did on each of these days, and I will be referencing that diary throughout tonight's presentation because while it's not purportedly about Grant Wood, they were there sort of in tandem with each other, and oftentimes were painting side by side in various locales, and in some cases were able to date certain paintings by Grant Wood to a very specific date, as a matter of fact. So so we know that they kind of got landed in a sort of flea bag hotel and it was full of fleas because Marvin clearly documents how they were practically eaten alive by the fleas. And they only stayed there a couple of days before they found better accommodations where they spent the rest of the summer. They're in Paris until the 18th of August. Then they make their way back to the United States by way of Antwerp, and they leave out of there, leave out of the Netherlands back for the United States to Montreal. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. This is a photograph of Grant Wood while in France. This was taken by Marvin Cohn. There's a very similar picture of Marvin Cohn taken by Grant Wood at the same restaurant, also enjoying a beer. Here, this is somewhat into their trip. We don't have a precise date for this particular piece. It's somewhat into the trip because Grant Wood has now adopted this facial hair, which he did not have when he left. He did grow it while he was over there. Upon returning to the United States, he did remove it. It was very, very European, and he did remove it when he came back to the United States. This is the painting that I'll be discussing this evening. It's called Misty Day, Fountain of the Observatory, Paris. It dates from 1920 on this trip, and it's a very small painting. It's only 7 by 10 inches. It's a sweet little thing, and it is depicting this fountain in the Observatory Gardens, and it's depicting a misty day. And this is a very kind of quintessential American Impressionism, or really represents the impressionistic moment in Grant Wood's career. You can see that he is utilizing a very loose brushwork, which was very typical of Impressionism, and he is very interested in light, in the way light falls upon features in the scene, and he's depicting a particular climactic moment. So he's really trying to picture a misty day, which I think he does extraordinarily successfully here. It is kind of a misty day, and that was very typical of French and American Impressionists. They were very interested in exploring the qualities of light at different times of the day, during different seasons, and under different weather conditions. And so, and oftentimes those elements that they're seeking end up in the titles of their compositions. And so it is not surprising for anyone who is familiar with Impressionistic work to see something like Misty Day in the title of a work. And so Grant Wood foregrounds that. Yes, it is a depiction of the fountain of the Observatory in Paris, but first and foremost, it's a depiction of a misty day. And so that is why that is the first part of the title. And this is the title that he gave the composition himself. So this is the Fountain Observatory is in the Observatory Gardens, which are part of a little sort of branch off of, and I'll show you in a moment a map, of the Luxembourg Gardens, where Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn frequently went during the summer of 1920. In Marvin's journals, he mentions going to the and sketching or painting in the Luxembourg Gardens no less than 11 times. And well, Paris is a big city and lots to see and do, and they certainly did a lot of that. The place that they went back to over and over again was the Luxembourg Gardens. And so this is sort of an offshoot of the Luxembourg Gardens. They are the Observatory Gardens due to their close proximity to the Paris Observatory, which was completed in 1692. It is the oldest observatory still in existence. One of the highlights of the gardens is this fountain that was created in the 19th century by the French artist Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. who lived from 1827 to 1875. This fountain was dedicated just 1 year before his death in 1874. It represents the four parts of the world holding up a globe. And you can kind of make that out just right of the center of the composition. You see the sculptural form. It's four figures holding up this sort of open globe. And then there are a series of horses coming up out of the water. And you can see just sort of in the foreground of the composition, in the lower right quadrant, you see this little sort of stylized or sort of impressionistic bird or duck in that water of the fountain. Again, very, very impressionistic. He's really trying to create just an impression of the scene, and what he's really after is this quality of light. So here's actually an actual photograph of the Carpeaux fountain in the observatory, and you can see that in all of its basic elements, Grant Wood has captured that. He really has, caught all of the basic parts of it, but he's done so in a very impressionistic way. Here's some details to give you a great sort of viewpoint of how loose his brushwork is in a composition like this. So when you get up close to it, and this would be extremely close to the composition. Don't get too close if you want to look at it in person. You can see that the horses, which you see on the right-hand side, just absolutely dissolve. It's just a series of beautiful brush strokes that, when you step back from the composition, actually could coalesce into the forms that make up the fountain. And here, front and center is that little bird. I want to say it's a duck, but I don't know that. It's a little bird that's sort of in the water there just above his signature. And you really get a great sense of how very loose his composition is, and how very impressionistic he is being in this composition. We know from Marvin Cone's diary that this painting was created on July 24th, 1920. He says in the diary, Grant drew in a big canvas of the Carpeaux fountain on July 24th, 1920. So, so I take that back. I step that back a little. This is not a big canvas. This is a very small work on board. And he could have done it as a preliminary study for a larger composition that he might have done either on site in front of the fountain, or also in the rooms that they were living in. But he would have done the small piece definitely on site. And so this could have been the same day, it could have been a few days prior to it, but we do know, according to Marvin Cone's diary, that he did do a larger version of this, whose whereabouts are unknown. Even if they survived the trip back, who knows? He could have painted over it. It was not unheard of. But on the 24th in 1920, July 24th. But this smaller one, in all likelihood, was a preparatory study for that composition. But it is finished. It's a finished piece. It's a signed and dated piece. Grant Wood considered this finished. It's not a sketch. It is a study, but a finished study for presumably a larger canvas. And our only indication that there is a larger canvas is from Marvin Cone's diary. Now, I promised you kind of a map to give you a sense of it. So, so here is a view of a portion of Paris. The Luxembourg Gardens are here at the center of this particular image. And then the Observatory Gardens kind of are this small little finger that branches off south of the main Luxembourg Gardens, and the fountain is at the furthest most southern tip of it, and that's where it is. The Pantheon is another important structure nearby that was a subject of interest for both Marvin Cone and Grant Wood, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But that's where the Luxembourg Gardens are in comparison to where the Observatory Gardens are. And here, a little bit wider view where you see more of Paris. You see the Eiffel Tower over here to the left. You got the Place de la Concorde right here, which runs, basically from the Louvre through the Tuileries to the Place de la Concorde, and then you can look up the Champs-Élysées to the Arc de Triomphe. And those were all sites and places that Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn visited on their trip, as documented in the diary. And some of them appear in their works that they created in 1920. So I wanted to take, as a part of this presentation, a few moments to explore some of the other works that Grant Wood created on this trip to 1920, which also have that very, very strong impressionistic quality to them, and demonstrate some of the places that Grant Wood painted on this trip, en plein air, usually on site, in front of these locales frequently, and what that tells us about the kinds of things that both he and Marvin Cohn were interested in. So one of those is this Place de la Concorde painting. You'll note that the measurements are 13 by 15 inches. Many of the pieces that Grant Wood created in his 1920 trip measure 13 by 15. These were kind of prefabricated particle board panels that were easy to transport, and were easy to acquire and to bring back to the United States. He very much enjoyed painting on particle board. Various forms, and they have various trade names, but it's basically a particle board, a paper board of some sort. And these were easy enough to take out into the location and paint en plein air. Marvin Cohn remarks in his diaries that especially when they're in the Luxembourg Gardens painting on an easel, that no one even bothers to stop and look, because Parisians are so used to artists painting en plein air, in the open air, we know that Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn both did this on this 1920 trip. This wonderful sculpture that flanks one of the gates, basically from the Place de la Concorde into the Tuileries Gardens, and then you can progress up the Tuileries Gardens all the way to the Louvre. And here you see this wonderful sculpture of a figure on horseback. Again, light is the subject matter here. And it's really about how that light is really sort of playing across the forms. There are certain elements. There's the wonder obelisk in the middle of the Place de la Concorde. And here I juxtapose it with a photograph of that same sculpture. It's still there. You can visit it, and you can really stand right where Grant Wood stood and get the sense. Obviously, from where this photograph is taken, you cannot. The obelisk did not move, but where Grant Wood was situating himself was slightly behind the sculpture. And so where he's standing in his painting is behind the sculpture. And so in that particular vantage point, the obelisk appears, behind the sculpture. And I think his positioning was very, very purposeful. And there are many different ways to capture this work. You could capture it, you really can't capture it straight on, because it's quite high. It's up above, but where he's standing, they have filled that in, and so you can stand and get fairly close to the work, but you have to be kind of behind the sculpture to do that. And I think that's made clear here. So you see the sculpture right here, and you can't really paint it well from this vantage point. You can't paint it straight on. You actually have to be slightly behind it, because above this entranceway, which is really just sort of an access point, I think these are public restrooms right here. You kind of come around and you scoop around, and you can actually be standing up here above this. So you actually can be standing on what would be kind of the rooftop of these restrooms to see it. So part of it was sort of practical, where he could get close to the work. But I think also he did not want to stand here because he did not want to include the Eiffel Tower in the composition. There are no compositions in any of the trips that Grant Wood took to Paris that include the Eiffel Tower. Now, it certainly was there in Grant Wood's time. It wasn't in a later edition. But he and Marvin Cohn both seemingly purposefully avoided representing it. It was sort of, in many ways, kind of more the modern Paris, not the old, historic, charming Paris And I'm just, just supposing here. But he purposely positioned himself in a way that that would not be included in the composition. And similarly, once you get past the Place de la Concorde and you look up the Champs-Élysées, there's the Arc de Triomphe, which is also not in the image that Grant Wood created. Now, they visited both of those sites. They visited both the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe. They certainly were wonderful tourists in that regard, but those pieces, those elements did not end up in any of their compositions. Interestingly, too, when we think about what Grant Wood includes and doesn't include in his composition, is this charming, small, often overlooked church, Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, which you see here. Again, wonderful impressionistic work. It really is all about the light. The sun is setting, it's striking the front of Saint-Étienne, and it's just illuminating the upper part of this rather small but sweet little church. Again, notice this is a 13 by 15 inch composition. You see figures. Figures aren't the subject matter here, but they are put in there. And you can see them sort of getting smaller. They do provide you with a sense of scale. This is Saint-Étienne-du-Mont in a more misty day, I guess, if you want to say. Here, and it certainly is churches you can visit still. But what is interesting is that Saint-Étienne-du-Mont is right next to the Pantheon. And you can see it right here to the left-hand side. There's Saint-Étienne-du-Mont right there. Right. What Grant Wood is not including in his composition is the Pantheon. Okay, so which is a major site in Paris. It's just off of the Luxembourg Gardens, very, very close, as a matter of fact. But Grant Wood avoids the Pantheon, avoids the more famous location, and instead chooses this little out-of-the-way, quite interesting and quite unique little church, which must have struck his fancy. And he's actually, to get that painting, he's actually standing on the side porch of the Pantheon to get that picture. I'm going to go back one. So he's actually elevated in a way, and he's standing on the side porch of the Pantheon. This part right here is the edge of the Pantheon building, purposely avoiding it to really explore all that the church has to offer him. Now, he did paint other things in the Pantheon. This is the thinker. And again, he's in the same locale. This is the Pantheon. For a while, not presently, but for a while, Rodin's thinker was positioned out in front of the Pantheon. And apparently, according to some stories, he actually got too close to the thinker while he was painting it, and some gendarmes asked him to move back a bit. But he did paint the thinker, Rodin's thinker, out in front of the Pantheon, and we know that it was placed there in 1906, and certainly was there when Grant Wood visited in 1920. It is no longer positioned there. Here, sort of one of many different images that Grant Wood did of Paris on his 1920 trip. Again, same composition board, same size. This is the Avenue of the Chestnuts. I've not been able to identify the specific locale of this place, but here, just a sort of a wonderful little street scene. There are figures, but you can barely make them out walking along the sidewalk here. It's in front of a a cigarette or tobacco store that you see here. And of course, front and center, of course, is this wonderful little pissoir, this public urinal that one would enter. You've got this wonderful little sort of shield around it that would give you a modicum of privacy, but a wonderful little pissoir here. And you see the gate to what is probably one of those little pocket parks that are quite frequent, scattered all over Paris. Here, another wonderful little street scene, old and new looking at a corner cafe. And again, this is all about light. This is, you can see how the light is hitting the side of the building on the right, and the small figure there is actually casting a wonderful little shadow on the wall. Again, Grant Wood at his impressionistic best. Here from the Roman amphitheater, and even though the Roman amphitheater is a significant Roman relic in the heart of Paris, really, you're not seeing the amphitheater. What you're seeing are the buildings that grew up around the amphitheater, and you're seeing a woman with a baby and her carriage there, and then you see this gentleman here in a boat or hat climbing up the steps that lead up to the Roman amphitheater. So he's actually turned his back on the amphitheater to capture this sort of slice of life in Paris, because this, I think, to him was really true Paris. This was authentic Paris. The Roman ruin obviously is still a part of Paris, and it interested him, but this, I think, interested him even more. Here, the Lost Estate from 1920. We don't know, I doubt that this is a depiction of Paris at all, and it seems to be really more philosophical composition than one that sort of represents Paris. But I included it because you can really see his loose brushwork in a composition like this. And you can really see how it's really about the dapple of light across surfaces that is fascinating him in a composition such as this. Here, Gate in the Wall. This is from Paris, and again, really the same dimensions, again on composition board. This is in all likelihood part of an old Roman gate in the city of Paris, which I have not been able to locate and may no longer be there at all. But again, very impressionistic. It's really, he's loving this sort of framing technique that the gate provides him with of this scene. Basically, it's just a street scene, an everyday scene in Paris, where more modern buildings, if you want to call them that, are juxtaposed with this gateway that is 2,000 years old. We believe this work dates from around 1920 as well. It belongs to the Cedar Rapids Community School District, but I've been showing you so far all works that we have in our own collection. But I included it because there are a couple of references in Marvin Cohn's diary to where he and Grant Wood painted along the Seine, or painted near the Notre Dame, or painted by Notre Dame. So there are at least 3 different references in Marvin Cohn's diaries that they painted along the Seine. And I wanted to include this one because you can see, again, the painterliness, the loose brushwork that Grant Wood utilizes in a composition such as this of a famous monument. So he didn't eschew all famous monuments. Paris is in some ways quintessential with Notre Dame. And so, but he's, I think, generally speaking, much more interested in the everyday, the commonplace, where the real character of Paris comes through. We believe that he spent some time looking around Notre Dame, because we think that these sketches that are in our collection represent heads from some of the statuary on the facade of Notre Dame. That's been our best determination. So these are some of the statues of various personages. Sometimes they're saints, sometimes they're kings, that adorn the facade of Notre Dame. This character in particular on the right, I think, is a fairly good match to the sketch that Grant Wood did, which we believe was done in 1920 on the facade. I mean, all we have is wooden saint facade of Notre Dame. So yeah, it could be of the stone. There was a wooden saint that predated the stone one, and so he could be sketching this in a museum as well, because many of those statues still do survive. They're brought in out of the elements. But yeah, this would have been the kind of reference point that Grant Wood was using in these little sketches, which are all pretty loose as well as far as their line work. But they didn't, Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn didn't stay in Paris the whole time during this time. They did do a few small side trips. And so one of the side trips that they went to was Châtenay, which is about 11 miles from the heart of Paris. And you can see that they went, according to the diary, they went on these 3 days, July 1st, July 2nd, and the 15th. So not too long after they arrive in Paris, they take their first day trip out to Châtenay. And so that was also a source of visual imagery for them. Here is a map. The heart of Paris is at the bottom, and then Châtenay is up here at the top, where you see this sort of red marker here. And this is the kind of work that Grant Wood created. Again, a composition board, same dimensions, and this is the small fountain of Voltaire in Châtenay, and it's a tour de force of impressionistic brushwork. He really, really loves the dapple of light coming through those leaves. Really, really exquisite composition. Or here, on a little bit grayer day, he's capturing a street in Châtenay from the same summer. Or here, a square in Châtenay. Again, shadow, light. It doesn't have the same level of dapple that we saw in the first composition, but still very much in this impressionistic vein. They also traveled out to Ville d'Avray on the 12th, the 13th, and the 16th of July. Ville d'Avray was where Corot's studio was. So Corot was an artist that many artists, when coming to Paris, would pay homage to, and when even after he passed away in 1875, people would still visit his studio and still visit the locale. Corot was huge for artists in studying in this time period, and so oftentimes they would go to Corot's gardens, Corot's studio, to paint. The Ville d'Avray is about 10 miles from the center of Paris. So here you see on the right-hand side, here's the Eiffel Tower. And you go past the Bois de Boulogne, which is a large garden area, past Sèvres, where the porcelain factory is, and here where all of these little red things is where the Ville d'Avray is. And here a fairly large composition that Grant Wood did in 1920 called At Ville d'Avray. And you can see here's the edge of Corot's Pond with a little walking path. Again, very, very picturesque, very, very loose brushwork, but different kind of brushwork he's utilizing here, much thinner brush strokes. Or here, the reverse of Corot's Pond. And you see Corot's studio in the distance with a little red roof there. You see these wonderful trees hanging over Corot's Pond here, and it's really all about reflection and light. Really, really kind of a tour de force of capturing reflection. And here, something that's actually been called and labeled Trees Leaning Over Indian Creek, but I wonder if really it's actually a depiction of Corot's Pond again. It was done in the year that Grant Wood was there. It's very, very impressionistic. It's very, very loose brushwork, and I think it could just as easily represent a scene in France as it may also, or may instead, represent Indian Creek. I just wonder when I look at this composition if it's not Indian Creek, but rather Corot's Pond. And Marvin Cohn and Grant Wood took a day trip to Versailles on July 30th, 1920. And Versailles is about 18 minutes away from the heart of Paris. So you see Paris right here in the center, and then Versailles is actually beyond Ville d'Avray. So you got to pass all of that and get over here to Versailles. So not impossible. They took the train. It's easy enough to get there. And of course, Versailles has this very large chateau in it, and that is the reason most people go to Versailles, although it is its own city. And there was, with all of this to paint, what does Grant Wood choose to paint? This tiny little fountain, a little pool in Versailles. It's also a very small composition, similar in size to Misty Day. Again, very, very loose brushwork here. It is a representation of this fountain, which still exists and still runs. The gardens at Versailles are ginormous. But he found this one fountain in these enormous gardens and chose to depict just a portion of it, this wonderfully oblique angle, capturing just one of the lions, it is so sort of idyllic. It's a wonderful little secluded corner of the gardens, and Grant Wood found it, and that was his takeaway from his visit at Versailles. I should mention also that Châtenay has a castle in it that also did not get represented by Grant Wood. Instead, he was more interested in those little scenes of everyday life from Châtenay. Not everything that Grant Wood did on this 1920 trip were vignettes of the city. Unfortunately, the summer that Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn went to Paris was very, very wet. It rained a lot. And there's frequent citations in Marvin Cohn's diary about it being too wet to be outside, too wet to paint and stuff. So they did a lot of indoor work. And one of them this is Grant Wood's drawing of Marvin Cohn for a low relief bronze that he wanted to create. And there's a couple of references to it in Marvin Cohn's diary. First, on July 4th, he sat for Grant Wood to create this drawing. So this drawing, in all likelihood, dates precisely to July 4th, 1920. And then he does also sit again for him on the 22nd. Ultimately, this bas relief, this low relief, was created from the drawing and was cast in France. It's small. It's a small piece, but was a wonderful item, both from our collections. But this is how they entertained themselves while it was raining outside or too wet to be painting outside. Another thing was to do self-portraits. And here's a self-portrait that Grant Wood did during that summer on his quintessential kind of brown paper. A really wonderful one. You see it's after he's adopted his facial hair here, so probably later during the time he was there, certainly July, if not August. And then they weren't done after the trip was over. I should say after being in Paris was over, and they make their way back to the United States. He created this wonderful little sketch on the boat coming back from France. So they take the boat back. Here there are cedar rapidians on the boat, both going and coming from Europe. Here's one of James Bever Norris, and that he did, and you can see he signed it, and he did it aboard the Grampian. So he's on the Grampian while he's doing this one. If you are interested specifically in Grant Wood and his portraiture, I just want to mention that this Sunday, our curator, Julia Jessen, will be doing a Grant Wood in Focus presentation on Grant Wood's portraiture. And she will be discussing some of these, some of the portraits that Grant Wood did throughout his career. So if you're interested in that, that presentation will be a few days from now on Sunday at 2 p.m. And then it will be recorded and put onto our YouTube page, and so you can pick it up then if you don't have a chance to join her on Sunday. But I know that she's going to touch on this image as well. But he was continued to be busy throughout the whole trip, including I understand from what I've read, that they had a small little exhibition of their paintings, Marvin Cohn and Grant Wood, on the boat on the way back, and obviously Grant Wood was still making artwork while on the boat coming back. Here, I want to leave you with a photograph aboard the Grampian in September of 1920. They're on their way back. You can see the full photo on the right, on the left, excuse me, and the detail on the right. And here's Marvin Cohn holding a camera. Here's Grant Wood. In all likelihood, this was taken with Grant Wood's camera, since Marvin's still clutching his. They are with some individuals from that they met aboard the boat. It's interesting because it's on this trip back from Europe that Marvin Cohn meets Winifred Swift, who's become his wife in August of 1921. They meet, they fall in love, and are wed within the year. She and her sister were returning from France, where they were visiting World War I graves that lost their family members in World War I. They were originally from Canada, and as I mentioned, the boats that they took departed and returned to Montreal. So there were a number of Canadians aboard, not surprisingly, and Winifred was one of them, who was to become, the future Mrs. Marvin Cohn. And so that kind of gives you a whirlwind view of Grant Wood's trip in 1920 in the summer. And these are just some of the works, not all of the works that he created. And I think they provide a nice context for Misty Day, which is, as I said at the start, really, really extraordinarily charming piece that has ticks all of the boxes of Impressionism, and really shows Grant Wood in full mastery of this technique of Impressionism. He does eventually move away from this later in his career and adopts a whole different style. But at this moment and throughout much of the 1920s and before, it wasn't as if he went to France and discovered Impressionism. He was already an Impressionistic painter before he left for France. It just sort of reinforced what he understood of the movement, and he continues to paint in an Impressionistic manner throughout much of the 1920s, and really sort of changes his style only at the very, very end of the 1920s to what we call his mature style, which is quite different. Gone are the loose brushwork that characterize his Impressionistic style. Light always continues to be important to him. It just takes a very different form in his mature style. But this Impressionistic style was very, very popular in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, and lasted well into the 20s and to a certain extent into the 30s for other artists, 30s and 40s, and for other artists. But Grant Wood does change his style beginning in the late 1920s. So, and with that, I think I will stop sharing and see if anybody has any questions that they could either pop them in the chat or just unmute yourself and feel free to ask any questions on anything that I may have mentioned. Okay, if no questions, how about an observation? Oh, here's a question. Okay. Do you think Grant Wood bought most of his supplies in Paris? Yes, absolutely. We have in Marvin Cohn's diary, we have a ledger of what Marvin Cohn spent, and they bought their supplies there. So we do know that they bought their supplies there, and then brought those panels back. They had to declare what they were bringing back. I think they actually had to even pay duty on it, on their own paintings coming back in. But yeah, they bought their materials there, the particle boards and the pigments there. So let me temper that. They would have had some materials with them already. Let me say that. I know they probably bought most of it there. I know this because I know we have from Marvin Cohn a painting of Montreal that we believe he did before the boat left Montreal for France. I believe that they had some materials with them because they were doing some work there and elsewhere. So yeah, I think they had some materials, but I think the plan was to buy most of it while they were over there. Let's see. Let's see what's another question. What was your favorite part of Paris? Well, all of Paris is my favorite part, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I love all things about Paris, but it is wonderful to go to Paris and with the knowledge of the images that Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn created, because you can really sort of connect on a very different level to their work when you're sort of really standing in the same location and conjuring up the image of the piece. It just adds more to it. But yeah, in Paris and in France in general, love the museums, of course. Love the food. Love walking around. You can just walk about everywhere. It's a big city. It has a good metro, which is helpful. But there's the food, the culture, the museums. There's so much just being in the space. There's so much to enjoy about Paris, and obviously Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn enjoyed themselves. They both vowed to go back again, and they did. Grant Wood does go back in 1924 and 25 to study at the Académie Julienne for a year. And so and he's still working in an impressionistic vein at that point. Then does go back in 1926 to have an exhibition at the Galerie Carmine, which he thinks and hopes would launch his career. But does not. And then Marvin does go back in the late 1920s to Paris. I believe that's right. Yeah, 1929, I think. And so they do get back, both of them separately to Paris. But this was a trip that they went to together, and I can just imagine them romping through Paris. So. Let's see, does CRMA have paintings of Versailles by Marvin Cohn? I assume somebody thought I would ask. No, I don't have anything. Nothing comes to mind of Marvin Cohn depictions of Versailles, but Grant Wood got one off. So they may exist, I just may simply be unaware of it. But I don't, if we have anything, it might be a drawing, but I don't have a recollection of a drawing of Versailles by Marvin Cohn. Question or statement here. Okay, Paris in the 1920s was such an iconic period. Do you have a sense who else they might have been socializing with during their time there? Yes, a little bit from Marvin Cohn's diary, but not. There were people from Cedar Rapids in Paris. There were people from Cedar Rapids who were traveling to Paris at the same time. They oftentimes got together with them while in Paris. They did go to theater. They did go to various restaurants, which are documented in Cohn's diary. But as far as seeing other artists, they do talk about going to the Louvre. They go to the Musée du Luxembourg in the Luxembourg Gardens, the museum there. We do know that they go to certain museums. They're not overly documented, but there are times when you talk about going to see other artists, but nobody that's super famous. Towards the end of this stay, they do a couple of times go and visit an artist. I'm trying to find the name here. I want to say it's Huotari, but yeah, Huotari, Huotari. And they met with him a couple of times, but he's not an artist that I know anything about. But they did make their rounds. They did get to the various museums and stuff. But as far as other people, they tended to be each other's company a great deal. Not exclusively though. There were other people that they visited while in town, but not any of the big names that you associate with being in Paris in the 20s. Although who knows that we do know when Marvin Cohn went to Mexico, he did meet Diego and Frida, and so we have that well documented. But that was a bit later in time, and so I think if Marvin had run into anybody. Any artists or famous writers or anything like that, I think he would have made note in his diary, which is really quite lovely to read. Any other questions or comments? Well, as always, I went a bit long. But I appreciate your patience as we did our little own romp through Paris, and hope you enjoyed seeing some of the other works that Grant Wood created, which I think provide nice context for Misty Day. Misty Day is currently on view. Do come down to the museum and take a look at it. It is a nice representation of his impressionistic style. We have it on view for that reason, so that people understand kind of what the starting point was for Grant Wood artistically, and where he takes that style. And so we have a variety of works from the 20s. And this is one of the earliest ones that we have in the gallery. So come down, take a look at it, get up close and personal to it, but not too close. But look at his wonderful brushwork. I mean, people oftentimes just sort of are really kind of amazed at the overall composition that Grant Wood creates, but it bears. It's well worth looking at the details, looking at how he's laying down the pigment on the surfaces. It really gives you keen insight, I think. You can almost see him doing it, and it makes the composition very fresh and alive for anyone viewing it with that level of intensity. Because although Grant Wood left us way back in 1942, his work can still resonate today, and you can really, by looking closely, really take yourself right back to that moment that he was creating these really terrific pieces. So thank you all for joining me this evening. Please join Julia on Sunday if you want to learn more about Grant Wood's portraiture. Otherwise, if we don't see you in the museum, we'll see you on a future one night stand. Thank you.